Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the second of our lectures on this Grand Japan cruise. I'm so pleased to see you all out. I'm sure some people are hugging the pillows in their rooms, but we're glad you can be out here. I have to say it's always wonderful to see how many people come to my first lecture, but it's even more exciting to see how many people come to the second lecture because that gives me some idea how we're doing with it. So it's great to see you all this afternoon as we talk about religions of Japan. Already the first day, yesterday, I had some people asking me questions about Shinto because they had been in Tokyo or the environs around Tokyo, had seen Shinto shrines, and they confessed that they did not understand Shinto. Well, the religions of, all the religions of East Asia, and particularly Shinto, I think, which is the folk religion of Japan, are kind of difficult for us to understand because there's some fundamental different principles that they're working on here, and we're going to talk about that today. As I showed you before, this is our list of lectures for the cruise. Tomorrow, after you return from the boat, after a beautiful sunny day on the shore, we will have a lecture on Japanese art and architecture, and I will help you understand some of the things that you are seeing and will be seeing in the rest of the trip. And then we'll get into more history and whatnot as we go through our cruise. One of the things I want to give you is this web address and also email address, and I'll give this to you several times as we go through the lectures. My wife Carolyn videotapes all of the lectures, and they are all available on a website free of charge. So this morning I had someone tell me they got in 10 minutes late for my first lecture and they missed part of it. Well, that's okay. Once we get back home, which unfortunately for watching the lectures won't be until late May, but when we get home in May, we will upload all of the lectures to this website, www.litchapala.org. That's actually the website for our Theological Institute in Mexico. It stands for Lakeside Institute of Theology. Chapala is the lake that we live on in Mexico. And so if you just go to that website, there's a tab that says Windstar Talks. And you can not only view any of the talks you missed from this cruise, but all of the cruises I've ever done. This is the 14th from Windstar. All of the lectures are on there. All of the PowerPoints, materials are on there. So you can go on there free of charge whenever you want and watch any of the lectures, see any of the materials. If you want to see a map again or an illustration, you're more than welcome to that. And if you have any trouble logging on or any other questions, this is my email address, rda@rossarnold.net. I'll be happy to be of help in any way I can in that regard. In addition to all of the lectures that I've done on Windstar, there are also lectures on that website that I've given in the local community on world religions, various other topics, and if you want, you could also take the whole 27-course seminary program that we have free of charge. So we have a 27-course seminary schedule, and you can take any of that material you wish. It doesn't cost you anything. So just to let you know, that's what that's about. I'll give you these addresses again later on. This is a list of the world religions today. A world religion is generally defined as one that is not limited to one country or one region. In other words, it's spread out, and that affects a significant number of people in the world. And of course, this is a list by date of founding. The oldest formal religion or world religion in the world is believed to be Hinduism. We could say animism was, and that touches a little bit on what we'll talk about Shinto. But Hinduism is the first organized religion, the roots going back as far as 4,000 to 2,500 BC, and I'll talk about that a little. Then Judaism, Buddhism, Chinese traditional religions, which include Taoism and Confucianism. I'm going to touch on those today because they've affected Japan. And then Shinto, Shinto being the folk religion of Japan. You'll notice this says there are 4 million adherents to Shinto. Pay no attention to that number. This is the official number, and I'll tell you why that's not valid in a few minutes. But to give you some sort of understanding of this, you can think of religions in terms of families. There are 3, or depending on how you look at it, perhaps 4 major families of religions. The one most of us are familiar with are the Abrahamic religions. Those are the monotheisms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All 3 of the great monotheistic religions in the world today, which are the 2/3 of the world's population now, are aligned to, our religions go back to one person, and that is Abraham, Father Abraham. And so the Abrahamic religions are the ones we probably know best. The second of the world religion groups or families is the Dharmic Religions. Dharma is the word for teaching. The Dharmic Religions began in India, and they include Buddhism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. I'm not going to talk at all about Jainism and Sikhism. If you want to know something about what they are, buy me a cup of coffee up in the Yacht Club, and I'll tell you about it. But we are going to talk about Buddhism today. The third school or family is the Taoic religions. You'll notice that Taoism, Taoic, is spelled with a T, but sounds like a D. Sidebar, let me give you a little thing. Have you wondered why it used to be Mao Zedong and now it's Mao Zedong? In the 1950s, they started a new way of transliterating Chinese letters into English letters. They used to use a system called the Wei-Giles system, and it had a whole lot of apostrophes and hyphens in it. They introduced a new system in the 1950s that's being used more and more and more called the Pinyin system. And so a lot of the words in Chinese, and that affects Japanese a little bit because there are several thousand characters that transfer directly from Chinese to Japan. They're spelled differently than they used to. What used to be Lao Tzu is now generally Lao Tzu in the Taoism. So T-A-O, Tao, is pronounced with a D. Sometimes it's spelled with a D. These are the religions of the Far East, especially China and Japan. It includes Taoism, Confucianism, and Shinto, along with versions of Buddhism. There are two major schools of Buddhism, and one of them, I'll talk about why in a few minutes here. One of them is an adaptation of the original Buddhism from India in order to have it fit in with the particular culture and history of the Far East. Sometimes we add a fourth religion, which are the Iranian family or Persian religions that predate Islam, which includes Zoroastrianism, which is still around. In fact, we visited a Zoroastrian fire temple, only the outside. You can't go in unless you are Zoroastrian or Parsi, but in India, we visited the outside of one of those buildings, and I met Zoroastrians. Zoroastrianism, Mandeism, and the Kurdish Yazdanism faiths like Yazidi or Alevi. If you've heard news reports about some of the persecution of some of the peoples by ISIS and others, then the Yazidi people have been one of those. They're considered heretics by the Islamic fundamentalists. So these are the four families of religions that we can talk about. One of the very unusual things, this chart which I just showed you about the founding of the religions, you'll notice the box. There is a phenomena that four or even more, because Chinese traditional religions includes Taoism, Confucianism in there, 4 or 5 of the major world religions all started within 100 years of each other, right around 500 BC. And we don't know why, but it was such a critical time in terms of the development of faiths, world faiths, that there's a special name for it. It's called the Axial Age. And so the Axial Age is the time when Buddha, Lao Tzu, who started Taoism, and Confucius, to use his Western name, all were alive at that time. And the founders of Jainism as well were alive, the 13 masters that were responsible for that faith. And so we don't know why, but there is a phenomena that this was a time when religious belief of various kinds really flowered around the world. Now, when I said that the Shinto number here of 4 million, don't pay any attention to that, because in Shinto is primarily limited just to Japan and Japanese people who have traveled to, are living in other places and have taken the faith with them. But Shinto, most Japanese, if you ask them what religion they belong to or what organized religion they associate themselves with, almost none of them will say Shinto. Because to them, Shinto is not a religion. It is a way of life. It is part of their history and culture. And so therefore, you only get 6 or 7% of the Japanese people will say that they belong to Shinto. But the fact is that 80% of the people, Japanese people, will practice Shinto. And so 80% of the people, it's estimated, have a Shinto shrine called a kamidana, literally it means God's shelf, in their home. And so they will recognize the gods, the kami, I'll explain all that, the spirits in the world as Shinto, but they don't think of that as an organized religion. In fact, many many of the Japanese, there's a saying that they live as Shinto, they get married as Christians, and they die and get buried as Buddhists. Because in Japan, the folk religion of Shinto is what they practice every day. Many of them in Japan, they love the Christian holidays. You know, they say at Christmas time, all the Japanese become Christian because they celebrate Christmas and decorate for it. They love the big white dresses of Christian weddings, and so they'll do that. But then, when it comes time to be buried, there actually was a time in history when Buddhists had an exclusive right to do burials in Japan. It's like, how do you get that monopoly? But they did. And so people would be buried as a Buddhist, and particularly, they still do that today because the Buddhist concept of the afterlife, at least Mahayana Buddhism, which is what's common in the Far East here, has a very much more positive view of the afterlife than does Shinto. Shinto's afterlife involves a place of shadows and darkness called the Shomi, and Shomi is very much like the Greek idea of Hades, a place of shades, and it's not very fun. There are ways to get out of that, according to the Shinto religion, but primarily they much prefer the idea of the Eastern Buddhist traditions, which involve, in the case of the largest tradition, Pure Land Buddhism, involves a paradise. It's very, very similar to much more of a Christian kind of idea of what the afterlife would be. So 80% of Japanese practice Shinto. Since there are 125, 126 million people, you get the idea it's a whole lot more than 4 million Shintos. But they simply don't check that box when surveyed, even though they practice it. About 35% of the people in Japan will identify themselves as Buddhist. So 80% Shinto, 35% Buddhist. What's wrong with those numbers? In fact, the majority of people, it's believed, in Japan will practice aspects of Shinto and aspects of Buddhism. Those two faiths, especially with a little Taoism, a little Confucianism thrown in, they have become so intertwined, so much a syncretism. Syncretism is when religious beliefs get mixed together, that there's a special name for it. They call it the Shinbutsu Shugo. Shinbutsu Shugo is the formal blending of the Shinto faith and of the Buddhist faith. Shinbutsu literally means the spirit of Shinto and the Buddhists. So Shinbutsu Shugo, almost all people will practice that. In the last cruise that we had, which visited, this is our third one in this series, our guide she identified herself when we went to a Shinto shrine as being Shinto. But then later on, she said, but, I practice Buddhism as well. And in her family home, her parents' home, they had both a kamidana, a Shinto shrine, and they also had a Buddhist shrine, both in their home, and they practiced both. So it's kind of hard to draw those hard lines, but to understand that there is a combination of things going on there. I want to talk about Shinto, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of the ancient Chinese religions that have affected Japan, particularly Taoism, Confucianism, and then we'll come back to Eastern Buddhism, all right? Shinto, or the technical name in Japanese is Kami no Michi. The word Kami means a spirit, a god, an essence. Now, it is not God with a capital G the way most of us Westerners think of God. When they talk about in Japan the fact that the emperor was a deity, they didn't mean he was the deity, because they have many. And a kami is a spirit, an essence. It can be from a person, from a mountain. Fujisan, the mountain, is considered to have a powerful kami, a powerful spirit associated with it. It can be a beautiful waterfall, an unusual rock. It's believed that certain people, especially the emperors, have kami associated with them, the spirit. And those kami are seen as a reflection of the musubi. Musubi is the interconnecting energy that's in the whole universe. Sort of like the Tao, Taoism, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. The idea that there's an underlying flow and power or energy behind everything. Shinto picks that up as well as Taoism, and we'll get into that. In Japan, there are about 81,000 shrines, Shinto shrines, and about 85,000 Shinto priests. It is the traditional folk religion of Japan. It's seen as being part of their culture, and to most Japanese, it's part of what it means to be Japanese. That's why they don't necessarily call it a religion. And if that looks familiar to you, that symbol up there, That's a torii gate. It's a two-cross top gate, which is always the entrance to a Shinto shrine. If you see that, that means this is a Shinto shrine, because it's indicated to be the gate. It's supposed to be the gate that marks a sacred place inside there from a secular place outside. So that torii gate is a very important symbol. The world that the kami live in is called Shinkai. The word Shin from Shinto and Kami mean the same thing. So the Shinkai is the world of the Kami. It's sort of like the Kami, the spirits or gods are around us all the time, but they're in kind of a different dimension and we don't see them. The only people who really are in connection with the Kami are those who truly are living the proper life, which is called the Kanagara no Michi, Kanagara no Michi, which means the way of the Kami. They are able to commune more directly with the spirit world, if you will, of the Kami that live around us. The great Kami, it's possible, I mentioned that the general idea after death of Shinto is a place of darkness, a place of shade and shadow. Well, you can get out of that if you become a great Kami or a guardian Kami. Do you remember what the suicide pilots in the Second World War, the Japanese pilots who intentionally committed suicide, were called? Kamikaze, which means divine spirit or divine wind. It was Kamikaze from back in the 13th century. There were 2 times that the Mongol, that is the Han Chinese armies, because China was controlled at that point by Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. They tried to invade Japan, and in both instances, there were typhoon winds that destroyed or blew back the ships of the Mongols. That was considered a miraculous intervention by the Kami, and so they called it a Kamikaze, a divine wind or a spirit wind. And in the Second World War, the Japanese decided to use that name, they technically were called special attack groups, to identify those who were suicidal, and not just planes, but also mini subs and torpedoes and all kinds of different ways in which they committed suicide. But they were called the Kamikaze because it was a divine wind or a spirit wind that they were representing. Again, this is the largest religious faith in Japan, even though they may not have identified as that, and it's very much oriented toward action rather than belief. It's more what you do than what you believe. In fact, a lot of religions are broken up in terms of orthodoxy, to use a Greek term. Orthodoxy is right belief. Christianity is primarily oriented toward right belief. Some religions are much more about orthopraxy, meaning right action. Islam is much more about right action. And you would say that Shinto is about right action. There's a big emphasis on purity, on ritual activity, particularly rituals in which you purify yourself. When you approach a Shinto shrine, for instance, which you'll identify by the torii gate, there always is a basin, a large basin of water that flowing water, there'll be water coming into it and draining out, and they have ladles. You are supposed to take the ladle full of water and rinse your left hand, then rinse your right hand, and then rinse your mouth out and spit it out in the stones that are around this basin. That's an act of ritual purification before you enter the sacred place of the torii, and I'm sure you'll bump into that because you'll be seeing Shinto shrines as we go along here. So purity is very important to the Shinto faith. And it is a belief that there are spirits, there are kami, and especially there's an emphasis on the kami or spirits of your ancestors. They say ancestor worship. It's showing regard for and respect for, but it's not worship in the same way that most of us in the West would think of worship of God, with a capital G again. But that's the focus of their faith, is that these spirits, these deities, these divine spirits are around them all the time, and they have a responsibility to respect them, to show regard for them, and so they will put out offerings for them. They will do ritual cleansing at shrines, etc. Now, there are a number of different types of Shinto. I always have to look back to make sure I'm on the right slide here. The most common is called shrine Shinto. These are public shrines. Most of what you will be seeing, virtually all, will be part of shrine Shinto. Prior to the Meiji Restoration, remember I talked about that a little bit this morning if you were here, that was the huge turning point in Japanese belief or Japanese nationality when they really started becoming modernized. Well, the Meiji Emperor looked around, and one of the things that he didn't like is that all of the shrines were independent. Some were well cared for, some weren't, and so he brought all of them together, the Meiji Emperor, under an association, and today there is an association of Shinto shrines that over 80,000 shrines belong to, and they are cared for by this association that was set up by the government a long time ago. Most of the shrines you'll see will be part of that. It's by far the majority. There's also Imperial household Shinto on the grounds of the Imperial residence in Tokyo. There are 3 different shrines, Shinto shrines, that only the Imperial family can worship at. There is also folk Shinto. Folk Shinto is sort of like the Southern, I'm from the South, so Southern fundamentalist kind of thing. Folk Shinto is a fragmented collection of different kinds of folk beliefs. There's a lot of superstitious kind of pieces in it, beliefs in deities and other kinds of spirits. They practice divination, there's spirit possession, there is a big focus on shamanic healing, so a lot of the kind of miraculous manifestations that come out in folk Shinto. Sect Shinto are private, as opposed to the shrine Shinto. Sect Shinto are private, local religious communities or shrines that have a different focus. There's 5 major kinds of these sect Shintos. There is pure Shinto, it's called. One is Confucian sects that are strongly influenced by the Confucian faith out of China. There are mountain worship sects, like Mount Fuji, for instance, would have a sect related to them. Purification sects, and then faith healing sects. So you have different kinds of these sect Shintos. And then you have a group called Ko Shinto. Literally that means old. Anytime you see Ko on the front or back of the word, it means the old way. So Ko Shinto is an effort to try to get back to Shinto before it was influenced by Buddhism, which was in the 6th century AD. So these are all the types of Shinto. In terms of some theology, again, primarily it is the recognition of the kami, the gods or spirits or spiritual essences, all of which are part of this musubi, this force that is running through the universe, the energy that is behind all things. I mentioned the Kanagara, which means the way or the path of the kami. That's the right order, the natural order of things. And a person who is walking the Kanagara no Michi, they are going to be more in connection with the kami. They are going to be living more the kind of life they should be. They'll be more pure. They'll be more ethical. Their lifestyle, personal purity, their sincerity, and their relationships will all be of a higher order. And then let's all say this together. The Amino Menaka Nushi. Amino Menaka Nushi is seen as the creator spirit, that literally is translated heavenly ancestral god at the originating heart of the universe. The first kami, the very first spirit. And then from this first kami, several additional kami came along. In fact, I'm going to, excuse me for doing this, but this image, I should move this over to the other slide. This is an image of 2 of the creation gods. Izanagi is literally means he who invites. Izanagi is he who invites. Izanami is she who is invited. The creation myth in Japan is that Izanagi and Izanami came into being, and as they walked around the world pillar and saw one another, before Izanagi, the male god, could say anything, the woman spoke first, Izanami, and ruined everything. Because she is the one who is invited. He is the one who is to invite. And so he said, wait, back up. And so they had to go back and once again come around the world pillar. And Izanagi spoke first, and he basically, when I talk about the arts, I'll talk about that a little bit in terms of the first poems in Japanese. But this is an image of Izanagi and Izanami, and the story of creation is that Izanagi dipped his spear into the ocean, And when he lifted it out, the drops of water off of the tip of his spear created the islands of Japan. And that's the creation myth. Interestingly enough, a Shinto theologian not very long ago said, well, this is such a far-fetched story, it has to be true. You know, the very fact that it is so unlikely is exactly why we believe it's true. So that was an interesting kind of approach to theological interpretation, I think. So this is Izanagi and Izanami, the foundation myth. There is a big focus, as I said, on purification. Impurity is one of the greatest of problems to the Shinto, and so there are a lot of different rituals for purification that are a vital part of practicing Shinto. And as I say, there also is a doctrine of the afterlife, although they much prefer the Buddhist version, and so they often will focus on the Buddhist idea of the afterlife, particularly Pure Land Buddhism. And I will tell you what that is in just a minute. I already mentioned Torii. You'll be on the lookout for those. There's another image of one up there. That you'll know that is a sacred place. That is a Shinto shrine. Shinto shrines are seen as the places in which the kami are most readily available. They sometimes are focused on, again, beautiful waterfalls or unusual rock formations, but because they believe there are kami associated with that. But shrines are literally the places that you could go that the kami are more readily available to you, and that's why they're set aside as sacred places. Okay, I want to talk about a couple of other religions now that have greatly affected not only Shinto, but also some of the other faiths. The picture on the left here is called the vinegar tasters. I don't know why they're standing around a barrel of vinegar tasting it, but they are. This represents the three teachings, as they're called: Buddhists, Taoists, and Confucianists. These are these three traditions have always been understood. Now, two of them, Taoism and Confucianism, began in China. Buddhism began in what was then India, now is the southern part of Nepal in terms of where the first Buddha, Gautama Buddha, was born. The image on the right is a fascinating one. It's called Confucius Presents a Young Buddha to Lao Tzu. So the founder of Confucianism, again, Kongfuzi is his Chinese name, but Confucius is what we know him as. Confucius presenting the founder of Confucianism, presenting the founder of Taoism, Lao Tzu, with a young Buddha, because they were all alive at the same time. So I want to talk very briefly about Taoism and Confucianism, two Chinese religions that have affected the belief in not only China, but in Japan as well, and in Korea. This is an image of Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu. Again, the spellings have changed in the last 60 years or so. He is the founder of Taoism. Taoism is somewhat like Shinto, is more understood as a way of life than it is as a religion. The idea behind Taoism is that the universe is connected. Everything, past, present, future, the physical world, the spiritual world, everything is connected by a force that is the Tao. The Tao is the force that flows through all things. In our culture, when people say, go with the flow, or, you know, I was in the groove, those are modern ways of us talking about sort of getting, you know, feeling like, yeah, now I'm into the flow of things. The best popular culture reference to this in recent years has been Star Wars, the Force. The Force is behind all things. The Force runs through all things. You know, allow yourself to be led by the Force. That's perfect definition for what Tao is supposed to be. And so Taoism is a process whereby one is supposed to learn what that flow is, to get oneself in tune with that, to not find yourself in opposition to it. Now, this, if it's, I mentioned the musubi, the force in Shinto that is behind all things and runs through all things. It's very much like the Tao. And so those are ways in which the Tao has strongly affected the Shinto and has become not as actively practiced, although there is Taoism in Japan, but it is very much behind the other faiths. We then have Confucianism, which was founded by Kongfuzi, Confucius. It's sometimes called Ruism because that character up there is the Chinese character Ru, which means scholar. Confucius also did not propose a religious system per se, but instead he created a system by which society and individuals in society can more productively live together. It's moral, social, political, religious thought, and very strict rules about identifying your place in society, accepting your place in society, and then fulfilling the obligations you have associated with that. Very strong emphasis on loyalty to family, and even more so to whoever your lord is, whoever the person is that's over you in society. When I talk later about, for instance, the Kamikazes, the influence that Confucianism had on them, the idea of loyalty to the emperor above all, for the samurai, who were the predecessors to all of that, their loyalty to their master and their willingness to commit suicide if they failed their master. You see, as we talk about this in other lectures, you'll see how both Taoism and Confucianism have greatly influenced all of this. So these two, and particularly Confucianism and Taoism in China, evolved into what's called Neo-Confucianism. I'm not going to get into that a lot, but that transferred over to Korea, and then from Korea, some of the Neo-Confucian thought came over to Japan. Korea was very much influenced by that. And because Confucianism, and especially Neo-Confucianism, have such a strong emphasis on knowing your place in society and fulfilling your place, the idea of personal advancement and of making it about me as opposed to society or about those who are my superiors, there was very little of that in the history of particularly Neo-Confucianism and how it came across to Korea especially, even more so, and then Japan later. This chart gives you, now I want to talk about Buddhism for a few minutes. The development of the Indian or Dharmic religions. The early middle Vedic period, that's a historical period, and I've got up here 2500 BC to 850 BC. This is more the middle Vedic period. Ancient India, and part of what is now Pakistan, the Indus River Valley, developed a system of beliefs which eventually evolved into modern Hinduism. I've got the later date up here. The previous chart I said 4000 and 2500 BC. That's where the roots were. But it's about 800 BC that Hinduism took the form that we know of it now. And then, as an offshoot of Hinduism, we have both Buddhism and Jainism occurring around the same time. The dotted line down here, I'm not suggesting that Islam came out of Hinduism, that's not the case. But Islam developed around, in the late 6th, early 7th century in Saudi Arabia, and then Sikhism, particularly in Pakistan today, in parts of India, that developed as sort of a middle ground between Hinduism and Islam. There are a lot of aspects of Sikhism that are very Hindu. There's some aspects that are very Islamic. And so this is not to suggest that Islam developed out of Hinduism, but to show that Sikhism is a combination. But Buddhism, as it originally was founded in current Nepal, in what was then India, is the product of one man initially, who was the Siddhartha Gautama, or Gautama Buddha. Buddha literally means the awakened one, or the enlightened one. Gautama Buddha was born in, again, 560 to 490 BC, somewhere in there. We don't know exactly. And there is a particular story of his early years story is very important. When he was just a child, he was a prince. His father was a king of the whole region. And an astrologer, soothsayer, came by and met the father and the son, and he told the father, the king, your son will either be a great ruler or he will be a very holy man, one or the other, depending upon what he experiences. Well, the Siddhartha Gautama's father thought, I want him to be a ruler. And so he basically put him under house arrest in the castle, in the palace. He had anything he wanted. You know, he had everything he could imagine, but he couldn't go outside until, as a young man, he finally left the palace and goes out, and he had what's called the four sights. He saw for the first time, he had not seen suffering before. He saw an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and an ascetic, that is a spiritual man who was practicing self-denial as part of his spiritual discipline. Because of these experiences, mostly of suffering, Buddha decided that he was going to enter into a lifetime of trying to figure out what was the cause of this suffering and death and old age, and what can we do about it. So he first studied meditation and became a master of meditation, but did not find any satisfaction in that. He then tried asceticism, that is denying himself. He starved himself. He allowed himself to experience pain and exposure in the elements. You sometimes, and it's surprising if you've never seen one, the first time you see it, there are statues of the Buddha during his ascetic period where he looks like a skeleton because he almost starved himself to death. And he decided that didn't do it either. So finally he sits down under a Bodhi tree, as it was called. It's a Ficus religioso, is the kind of tree. And he said, I am not getting up until I find enlightenment, until I come to an understanding of the human condition. And after many, many days, he came to the revelation that it is neither asceticism, self-denial, nor is it self-indulgence that will give you the truth, but rather that there is a middle way. And Buddhism is sometimes called the middle way for that reason. And he developed the basic, there are four laws and 8 principles. In fact, you'll often see this thing that looks like a ship's wheel up there, which has 8 spokes. It's an 8-spoked wheel, which represent the 8 noble truths that we'll talk about. Now, today there are many different kinds of Buddhism. Many different kinds of Buddhism. The 2 major ones, in terms of the sort of umbrella, the original Buddhism is called Theravada. This is what the Siddhartha Gautama Buddha taught. Theravada literally means the school of the elders. It's the oldest of the approaches to Buddhism. But much of what the Buddha, original Buddha, came up with had to do with coming out of the Hindu faith. Buddhism was non-theistic. Theravada Buddhism is non-theistic. There is no doctrine of God. There is no discussion of God. It has to do with understanding the human condition and what to do about it. But the Theravada Buddhism had a lot to do with the principles or the ideas of samsara. Samsara is the Buddhist belief, and Hinduism as well, that one is born into life, you live a life of suffering, you die, and then you're reborn. And you live, and you die, and you're reborn. This cycle of transmigration of the soul, what we call reincarnation, was fundamental to the Hindu thinking, and therefore Buddhist. And so a lot of the principles of the original Theravada Buddhism had to do with that. Well, when Buddhism then started translating into the East, primarily by the Silk Road, and it ended up getting as far as Japan by the 6th century AD, that didn't make sense to them anymore. It didn't make sense to them. The Buddha said that the ultimate goal is to achieve nirvana, which means nothingness, to be extinguished, to not have to come back and suffer anymore. And they're all going, what? That's the goal? From a class I taught once, I had a roommate long before I met Carolyn, and he said, so if I understand this right, Buddhist doctrine, if I die and I have been an okay person, I come back as a person and I have to try it all over again. If I die and I've been bad, I come back as a beetle or worse. If I've been really, really, really good, I don't have to come back at all. That's nirvana. And as trite as that sounds, that's a pretty accurate description of the basics. Well, the rest of the Eastern Asia, when it moved over into China, Korea, and Japan, they did not have these concepts of reincarnation, samsara. That didn't make sense to them a whole lot, and so it completely changed. And they now have the second major school, which is actually much bigger now, the Mahayana school of Buddhism, which means the great vehicle. It's the great vehicle because included in it are a lot of other different kinds of Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Nichiren, Tibetan or Vajrayana Buddhism, and others. And I'm going to talk a little bit about which of those affect Japan, in just a moment. But first, the principles that all Buddhism are based on. First, in Buddhism, there are the 4 noble truths that Buddha developed. This was what the revelation, the enlightenment that he received. First, the truth of dukkha. Dukkha means suffering, that all of life is suffering. And by dukkha, it means suffering, anxiety, unsatisfactoriness, unease, illness, anxiety, stress, everything that's hurtful, painful, difficult in life, grief, all of that is dukkha. And all of life, no matter where you are in life, you suffer some of that. Grief, illness, old age, aches and pains, injury, whatever, sickness. The second principle is the truth of the origin of dukkha. Where does that come from? It comes from, according to Siddhartha Buddha, craving and clinging to pleasure and aversion to what is not pleasurable. In other words, the reason we feel it as suffering is because our desire to get what feels good and to try to stay away from what is not pleasurable. Our very struggle is what makes it so painful, our inability to be able to accept it. So the third principle, the truth of cessation of dukkha, is to put an end to craving, and clinging will cause us no longer to suffer. We may still have physical pain, but it will not affect us as suffering in that regard. Then rebirth, dissatisfaction, and re-death no longer happen. Much of this is based upon ignorance, that we don't even realize what we're doing in terms of our cravings and of our desire for things. And then the fourth, the truth of the path of liberation from dukkha, is by following the Noble Eightfold Path. So from these four noble truths, it leads into the Eightfold Path. And those are, by the way, I'm doing a terrible disservice to all these religions. You know, I'm spending 45 minutes and telling you everything about several world religions. It's not quite fair, but it's the best we can do in the time we have. So the Noble Eightfold Path, which is called the Middle Way, is the way that the original Siddhartha Buddha, Gautama Buddha, said you can gain freedom from suffering or dukkha. First, right view, meaning accepting that the four noble truths about suffering are true. Right view means right understanding, that you understand your situation. Secondly, right intention, that you have right thoughts and aspirations. Third, right speech, that you speak rightly, no falsehood, no abuse, and no meaningless chatter. Fourth, that you take right action. You act in moral ways, you cause no harm to others. And that involves, for instance, being a vegetarian, not killing animals. Fifth, right livelihood, which means that you do not earn your living by working with weapons, degradation, meat, intoxicants, or poisons. You can't be a baron of the arms industry and be a good Buddhist. Sixth, right effort. You have to have disciplined thought, disciplined word, and deed. 7, right mindfulness, being alert to everything that affects us, paying attention. My wife will tell you tens of thousands of times I've said the greatest failing of humanity is not paying attention. Because if we paid attention, particularly to other people's needs, then we would not have the kind of conflicts that we have. And then finally, right concentration, which means right meditation. This is the Noble Eightfold Path, which the original Gautama Buddha said was the means by which we can get out of the cycle of suffering of human life. There's no doctrine of God in that at all. But then, when Buddhism moved to China, and from China to Korea, and from Korea to Japan, they developed a very different understanding because they came from a different background in terms of the beliefs that they had started with. As of 2014, in Japan, there were 377,000 plus Buddhist monks, and it's increasing, amongst priests and leaders in Japan. Now, as I said, in the 6th century, they believe the year is probably 552, although there's some question about that, Buddhism came to Japan from Korea, having migrated all the way from India originally. And today, as I said, 80% of Japanese will have a kamadana, a god shelf for Shinto worship in their home. 60% of Japanese also have a butsudan. A butsudan is a Buddhist shrine in their home. So there's a huge overlap in that. In the 12th century, and I'll talk about this later, at the end of the 12th century is when the first shogun, the Kamakura shogun, takes over. Minamoto was his family name. And he took over, and then between the end of the 12th century and the middle of the 19th century, the shoguns ran Japan. From that first shogunate that started at the end of the 12th century, the shoguns really liked Buddhism. And they really bought into Buddhism. Various kinds of Buddhism, particularly Zen Buddhism, affected a lot of what the samurai were about. The samurai were great warriors and they did not fear death, partly because they practiced Zen Buddhism, meditation Buddhism. And so all of the shoguns were huge fans of Buddhism. When the Meiji Emperor came along and they got rid of the shogun, the Meiji Emperor tried to get rid of Buddhism and to return them to Shinto. To a great extent, he was successful. He didn't eradicate it, but he reduced the amount of public visibility to it, and much of it went kind of underground. The largest of the Buddhist forms in Japan now is called Pure Land Buddhism. It is the most popular, and then we have Nichiren Buddhism, Shingon Buddhism, and Zen Buddhism, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about. The central figure here is Amitabha Buddha. There's been more than one Buddha. There was the one who started it, Gautama Buddha, but there have been many Buddhas, and there are different beliefs. Some believe that there's only one primary Buddha at one time, and only after that Buddha dies or leaves this world, whether they physically die or not is one of the questions, then another Buddha will come. Some believe that there are many, many Buddhas that are present at all time. That is, people, these beings that are fully awakened. The people on either side here, or the images on either side, those are Bodhisattvas. Do we have any Steely Dan fans in the audience? Steely Dan, the band? Okay, do you know the song Bodhisattva? 1973, Steely Dan recorded a song called Bodhisattva. And the words to that are, let me move over here. I got the words on the next page. Bodhisattva, Bodhisattva, won't you take me by the hand? Bodhisattva, Bodhisattva, won't you show me your Japan? Won't you show me shiny China? Bodhisattva, Bodhisattva, take me by the hand. Well, Bodhisattvas are enlightened beings that are not fully awakened. They have not taken the final step into becoming Buddhas yet. And the reason they have done that is because they want to stick around in order to help more people achieve enlightenment. So they do it as an act of generosity toward people. This central image is Amitabha Buddha, who is a fully fledged awakened Buddha. The ones on either side are two primary helpers to the Amitabha Buddha, who are Bodhisattvas. Pure Land Buddhism is the belief that the Amitabha Buddha, and it's sometimes called Western Paradise Buddha, that the Amitabha Buddha, if you have faith in the Amitabha Buddha and you recite a mantra or a chant to the Amitabha Buddha, then the Amitabha Buddha will, at the point of your death, take you out, and rather than you have to be reborn again or suffer some punishment, you will be taken out and delivered to a pure land, a Western paradise. The chant is Namu Amida Butsu. Namu Amida Butsu. And some Pure Land Buddhists believe if you say it once in faith, that's all it takes. Some of them say the more often you say it, the better off you are. And so there are differences in that as well. It is the most faith-oriented of all Buddhism, and it sounds a whole lot like some of the Christian beliefs. If you have faith, then at the point of death, you will enter into salvation or a kind of paradise, right? Well, the idea here is that the Amitabha Buddha has reserved that for those who have faith in him, and you'll see this manifested in some shrines, Buddhist shrines that you go to. The belief is that this world, no matter how hard we try, is still going to be corrupt. No matter how good we are, no matter how much we practice the right kind of things, the world is still corrupt. And our desire for an uncorrupted world is the principle behind there being a Western paradise that Amitabha Buddha will take you to. The second most popular kind of Buddhism is called Nichiren Buddhism. It was the teachings of a Buddhist priest called Nichiren from 1222 to 1282. Two major divisions. One of them think that the priest Nichiren was himself a Buddha. Others think he was not. The emphasis here is on reciting the Lotus Sutra, which is one of the sayings, you memorize and you speak these. This image up here is an image of that represents the Lotus Sutra. There's a major emphasis in Nichiren Buddhism that everyone has the potential for enlightenment now. It's sort of like serenity now. You can become an enlightened Buddha right now if you are guided the right way, and you can do that by studying the writings of Nichiren. There's a strong emphasis here on social responsibility and even political involvement. So much so, there are 37 different kinds of Nichiren Buddhism, and Nichiren Buddhism has quite often gotten in trouble with the government because they've gotten so politically involved that they created what the government saw as problems in their efforts to try to reform society. And so, but they're still very popular. There is then Shingon Buddhism, which literally means true words Buddhism. All of these are present in their own form, plus each of them, according to the principle of Shinbutsu Shugo, are also intertwined with Shinto. A person in Japan may be Shintoist, but also practice one of these kinds of Buddhism. This is the most esoteric Buddhism. It is more linked to the Vajrayana, like the Tibetan Buddhism. They have taken a lot of the Hindu gods over into their belief system. For instance, the god Indra, which is the king of heaven in Hinduism, is also considered a deity within Buddhism. Now, the original Gautama Buddha, the Theravada Buddhism, there were no deities. There was no focus on God at all. It was a non-theistic religion. These versions of Buddhism are very different because they all have some kinds of deities or spirits or essences that one is to recognize and, in many cases, worship. The same thing is true of Taoism and Confucianism. Confucius, for instance, said there are spirits, there are deities in the world, spirits like kami, like the Shinto say, but he said, make sure that you satisfy their expectations, but the best thing is try to avoid them if you can. All right, so there was not a big emphasis in Confucianism. But Shingon Buddhism, and there's another smaller sect of Buddhism called Tendai Buddhism. If you go to the temple to Kannon, Kannon, which is the goddess of mercy, that is a Tendai Buddhist temple. So it gets a little complicated. And the last one is Zen Buddhism, the one that you've probably heard of, whether you understand it. It started out in China as Chan Buddhism. It moved to Korea as Seon Buddhism. When it got to Japan, it's called Zen Buddhism. All of those are from the Sanskrit word which means meditation. So the focus in Zen Buddhism is to meditate. The idea of personal breakthrough to enlightenment, not somebody else giving you enlightenment, not somebody else saving you like the Amitabha Buddha, but rather that you can be enlightened by your own efforts. Three main schools. The Soto school focuses on Shikataza. This is Shikataza. It literally means sitting around. To sit and meditate until one is enlightened. That's the largest school. The second largest is Rinzai, and they focus on the use of koans, which are these puzzles or riddles. You've all heard what is the sound of one hand clapping. That's a koan, a Zen Buddhist riddle. The idea in Rinzai is that you will have a master, a Buddhist master, and they will present you with these word riddles, like what is the sound of one hand clapping. You are to meditate on it and consider it and then come back and respond to your master. And the master will tell you whether you have achieved anything in terms of understanding. One of the famous and very strange koans in Zen Buddhism is, if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. What does that mean? The third form is abaku. That is meditation primarily by the use of arts, by calligraphy, by the tea ceremony, for instance, is used for meditation, and various other means. The Zen Buddhism has originated in China. It was greatly influenced by Taoism. It's trying to get in the flow of being in the force through meditation, etc. So all of these kinds of Buddhism, as well as aspects of Taoism and Confucianism, which joined into Neo-Confucianism, all of them have affected the religious beliefs in Japan, and particularly are held in belief alongside and interwoven with Shintoism in Japan.